people are willing to buy these dips from a stranger and meet me in the park to pick them up. There's something here. I had some health issues and had to cut a bunch of foods out of my diet. I started blending it in my own kitchen into dips and found myself making them almost every night for myself. There's a lot of people that are taking a bite of the apple before the brand actually gets paid. And as a result, the margins are very, very, you typically get one shot at these larger retailers. Maybe if you're very lucky, you get a
Kendall,
second
thanks
shot.
a lot for coming on the Shop to Scale podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
Definitely. So before we maybe start off, just give us a brief introduction about Cotto as a whole and how did the idea even come up in the first place?
Yes, so Cotto is a line of whipped cottage cheese dips. We take cottage cheese and blend it until it's totally smooth with no curds, and then layer in different savory flavors. We've got a French onion, buffalo, and a garden ranch that all taste like the dips you might have grown up eating, but with a lot more protein and a lot less junk. And I started Cotto because I was making these dips for myself. I had some health issues and had to cut a bunch of foods out of my diet. And as a result, was eating a ton of cottage cheese as a whole food source of protein, but was bored of always eating it plain, didn't always love the texture. And so I started blending it in my own kitchen into dips and found myself making them almost every night for myself. And then realized that there was tons of people all over social media doing the same thing, and thought there was an opportunity for a more convenient, ready-to-eat option where you didn't have to take out the blender all the time.
That's amazing. And I guess, do you think that, where does this craze coming in about cottage cheese? Like, it's kind of everywhere online. There's so many brands. I mean, yourself, Smearcase, Good Culture, there's a bunch of the brands that are doing incredible work in this space. So I guess, where do you see this coming in from?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. So I see really, first, of course, people are crazy about protein right now. And to some extent, packing it into everything through protein powders. And I think protein will continue to be something that consumers prioritize, just given it is satiating, it keeps you full, it helps you build muscle, and there are real benefits to protein. But I think the pendulum is swinging back to whole food sources of protein. And that's where cottage cheese really comes in. It's a great natural source of protein where you don't have to add the powders or isolates into another product. You can just eat it on its own, or in this case, as a dip, and you get a ton of natural protein that makes you feel really good. And that's kind of why I was eating it, was because all the additives and powders were not making me feel my best. And so to return to whole food sources of protein really helped me to heal and feel better. And I think in general, consumers now are realizing that when you eat whole foods and prioritize them in your diet, you can feel a lot better and be a lot healthier. And I think the next wave of cottage cheese innovation with brands like Smearcase is really taking cottage cheese as an ingredient and using it in other applications. So in their case, an ice cream, in my case, a dip, but it's really using the cottage cheese for its protein and nutritional value, but in more fun, snackable, exciting ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the end, like using it within dips, and dips are not supposed to be like the best, the most nutritionally bang for your buck per se. So the fact that you've been able to do that with dips is something incredible. So yeah, kudos to you guys for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe take me to the first, 90 days of launch, or even before the not launch. Like, what would those like first 6 months pre-launch, and then this first, let's say, 3 months post-launch look like? Just kind of walk us through from the start.
Yeah, so I would say from the moment that I realized that this could really be a product and not just something that I was making for myself as a recipe in my kitchen, I wanted to get really intentional about how I could validate that there was really demand out there beyond my friends and family trying the dips and saying they liked them, but to some extent always having some kind of bias, just given they're my friends and family. And so from there, I really set forth a plan to get the product out to consumers that were paying for the product as quickly as possible. And as you may know, in the food industry, it takes a really long time to find a co-manufacturer, get up and running, and actually have a product that you can sell in a retail setting. And so in place of that, I went into a commercial kitchen. I found one in New York City where I could get in pretty immediately and start testing out different dip formulations, different flavors. And I started building up an audience on social media pretty much as soon as I had the idea, so that by the time I was up and running in the commercial kitchen, I had built up an audience of consumers who were interested in purchasing this product. And I leveraged that platform to then sell the dips for pickup only in New York City that I was making in my commercial kitchen. And people would buy them online and then come and meet me in parks, Starbucks, all over the place to pick up their dips, which was a crazy, unscalable model, but it allowed me to really quickly validate that, okay, people are willing to buy these dips from a stranger and meet me in the park to pick them up. there's something here. And it also gave me a tool to refine the formulations really quickly. I could iterate week to week, whereas with the manufacturer, it's a lot slower to iterate. I was able to get that feedback, incorporate it, and continuously improve over the time in the commercial kitchen what the end formulation was, so that by the time I took it to a manufacturer and actually launched, I felt really confident in it, which is tricky with a refrigerated product. You don't always have the opportunity to do that. So getting creative about how to really get the product out there in the hands of people who were strangers and were paying for the product was top priority for me. And of course, lots of logistics and little things behind the scenes to make that happen. But that's really where I spent my focus, was building that audience and getting the dips into people's hands, so that behind the scenes, as I kind of made these tweaks to the formulations, I could be passing them on to the manufacturer that ultimately would make the product on a larger scale.
That's incredible. I mean, that just shows the hustle and just finding a new way, finding a more hands-on way to, I guess, validate the product in the end. Did you, I guess, how did you, I guess, what would be your advice for someone that to like build in public per se? I know a lot of people hear that you should build in public as a founder, lead your content creation per se. What's your advice on that? Like, does it work for all products? Does it work for some products? If like a new founder is coming to you and they want to, kind of build in public, I guess, what would your advice be to them?
Yeah, I would say it depends on how you're planning to build your business. So not for every business is it necessary 100% to build in public. But if you're a founder that is making a physical product, specifically a food product in this case, but I think something that people are going to physically interact with, I would say it's really helpful to start to build up that audience so that you can get the feedback, because ultimately you have at your disposal all of these people who could potentially see and engage with your content that can give you feedback pretty much instantaneously, which is something that I think companies spend lots and lots of money to get focus groups and surveys and test concepts. And I kind of viewed it as this was the focus group at my fingertips. Obviously, it's skewed in some ways to take it for what it is. But as I was refining things from a packaging perspective, I would just throw up, hey, option 1 or option 2, and get really quick feedback. So that was kind of the mindset shift that really helped me, was to view it as a tool to get feedback rather than getting all nervous about putting myself out there and is this embarrassing? I think when I thought about it as, okay, this is going to help me get from A to B as quickly as possible, how can I use this tool most effectively? That really helped me to take the jump and put myself out there. And I think the other piece of advice I would give is, I hear a lot from founders who have an idea and are thinking about starting a company, they're afraid to kind of put that initial version out there. And they're like, I'm going to build in public, but I'm not ready yet. I always challenge that and say, it's never too early to start. And sharing that concept early on can save you a lot of headache and money and time and resources, because you'll get feedback before you would otherwise if you hold it back and work on it and iterate just in your own silo before sharing it with the world.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I guess what was some feedback that you received during that time when you were building in public that genuinely really, really helped you? Maybe an example that could just kind of crystallize that thought, that genuinely really helped you when you went to the manufacturer for that kind of, when you went to manufacturer.
Yeah, for sure. I think one piece specifically around the packaging, which if you are in the CPG world at all, you know that you typically have to purchase a large amount of packaging at a time, and then you are held to use that, or if you have to really change it, then you have to pay for it and dispose of it. And so making sure that your packaging is really dialed in before you do your first manufacturing run is really important. And so one thing I did was, as I was working on the packaging design, I would give kind of, as I mentioned before, options on social media and say, hey, I'm deciding between option 1 and option 2. Here's the key difference. What do you think? And open it up for feedback that way. And so rather than making the decision that I thought was the best and printing thousands and thousands of versions of that package or that packaging, I was able to get the feedback before I made that decision, and then could purchase the packaging that I knew was validated by the consumers and the audience that I was building on.
Definitely. And then once you went to, I guess, the manufacturer, when you were in that conversation with them, were you able to show them, listen, this is the amount of social media traction that I have, and this is the amount of units that I've sold? Was that an easier conversation, I'm guessing, compared to someone who's
Yeah, I think to some extent it's different with a refrigerated product than other products, just given you can't really commit to crazy minimum quantities right off the bat because you don't have endless shelf life. And with a shelf stable product, if you produce a bit more in the beginning, you have more time to sell through it. And so I knew that I really had to have this demand lined up before I actually produced the product. And that was something that I was able to leverage, not only in the manufacturing piece of it, but also in the retailer conversations as I was opening up my first stores, especially to show them, hey, I have all these people that are coming to find me in a park to get these dips, and they could all come into your store instead. And using that traction to show them that they're already our customers and it's not as big, it's kind of de-risking the situation. You're not saying, hey, just carry my product and we'll see what happens. But instead, hey, I've tested it. I know there's people that come back week after week. And right now they're coming here. Instead, I could drive them to your store. It creates an opportunity rather than them having to take such a risk on you.
Definitely. So I guess were the first couple of retailer conversations, when you use the word easy, but was it, was it, I guess, not as difficult because you had that kind of data to show them that I'm selling these many units without being in a single retail store?
Yeah, definitely. I would say so. And I think too, something that was interesting was a lot of these retailers, especially when you're in the early days, if you're going into kind of specialty stores, they have a social media presence too. And even if they don't, they're probably looking for cool new products to bring into their stores online. And so what I found was not only were those conversations easier, but in a lot of cases, the retailers were actually reaching out to me saying that they wanted to bring the product into their stores, which was super cool and unexpected for me. But it gave me some leverage too to come in and say, hey, I'd love to be in your store. We need to be at this price point at this point in time because we're really early, we're new. And having them already wanting the product gave me the ability to say those things. Whereas maybe in another case where you're kind of begging them to take on your product, you're sacrificing on some of the other pieces. And not to say that was the case every single time. I definitely do my fair share of sales as well. But in the early days, especially, that was super.
Yeah. And have you guys made the jump from specialty, let's say, to more chain stores, or how's that jump been for you guys?
Yeah, we're not in any super large chains yet. We're in Fairway Market in New York, which is somewhat of a smaller chain, as well as West Side Market. And so starting to kind of expand into some of those Northeast, but chain stores that don't just have one or two locations. Starting to think about the transition now into larger stores and preparing ourselves for that jump too, because ultimately I want to get this product into as many people's hands as possible. And that will really be a key in the next phase of growth, is opening up those larger chain retailers.
You know, a lot of people listen to this, they want to start a CPG brand, let's say within the next 6 months, in the next, couple of months. What is it that you tell them about what a small retailer asks for compared to a larger chain store? Because you're starting to think about the chain stores now. So what is the difference between the two, that they're different asks, they're different requirements per se?
For sure. I think it's a couple of things. One that comes to mind is on the operational readiness side of things. The smaller kind of mom and pop shops are a lot more forgiving and willing to work with you to make sure that you can get your product in their store. And if you're out of stock for a period of time, they kind of have more understanding and you have a more direct touch point with them too. Hopefully you've been able to build a relationship to the point where you can be really transparent, explain what's going on, and they're still willing to bring your product back when it comes back in stock. I think there's less forgiveness when you start to knock on the doors of some of these larger chain retailers, and they really want to see that you are ready to scale. You have the foundation on the operation side of things to support them in the way that they will need to be supported. And ultimately, it's in everyone's best interest that you really are ready and you're not pretending that you are before you are, because you typically get one shot at these larger retailers. You maybe, if you're very lucky, you get a second shot, but being successful on the first go is very important. So it's not that they're being overly difficult, I would say, but it is really important that you're kind of ready to make that jump. And then I think the other thing is, and this is a little more in the weeds, but a lot of these specialty stores will say, hey, yeah, we'll try your product, drop it off tomorrow, and that's that, and they'll put it on the shelf. With the larger retailers, there's a lot more that goes into it, both on the cost side, but also on the operations side. I would say if you are not familiar at all with the grocery business, there's a lot of things behind the scenes that I definitely was not aware of before starting a brand, but things like free fills, which are free cases that you have to give to the stores before they start selling you. There's a lot of fees and costs that come, for example, if you are putting your brand on sale or are on promotion for a period of time, it's the brand paying for that and not the retailer, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize. And so being prepared for those things, but then also on the ops side, things take a really long time, not for every single retailer, but a lot of them it can be from applying to actually getting on the shelf anywhere from 9 months to even a year sometimes. They operate on strict review cycles often where they're only looking at certain categories at certain points of the year. And so that's something that I wouldn't have necessarily known going into this. But as you navigate the kind of chain retailer environment, it's something you learn very quickly to expect.
Yeah, I mean, I know you mentioned, of course, free fills and some of the costs, like for example, brands paying for promotions. Was there anything else that like really surprised you about the grocery business? But when you enter into it, you're like, wait a second, why is this the way that it is? You know?
Yeah, I think in general, the margin structure is pretty crazy. There's a layer between the brand and the retailer that I don't know that everyone necessarily knows about, which is the distributor. And that's kind of how do you actually get your product to the retailer. And the reason these exist is because it makes it a lot easier and more streamlined for the retailer to order products to be in their store. So rather than order from every single brand individually that's in the store, when you think about like a Whole Foods, they have so many different brands that would be quite the admin nightmare. Instead, they're ordering through the distributors. So there's some big ones like UNFI or KeHE. You might see their trucks driving around, and the retailers are ordering the product through them. So the brand sells it to the distributor who then marks it up and sells it to the retailer. So there's a lot of people that are taking a bite of the apple before the brand actually gets paid. And as a result, the margins are very, very slim, especially for early brands who don't have the volume yet and aren't seeing the economies of scale.
Yeah, and even once you actually get the product at the retail store and they sell it, then there's
Yeah,
MCVs and a bunch of other costs on top as well that yeah, I
totally.
mean a lot of people don't budget for. And then on top of that, the thing about Cotto is, of course, your refrigerated product. My bad, your refrigerated product in the end. So, what does that, I guess, change about the supply chain, or yeah, how does that add more complication to the whole process? I guess.
Yes, it makes everything all the more complicated and all the more expensive for sure. But I think on the flip side, people buy refrigerated products at a much higher frequency. And so the hope is that at some point it would even out. But it is, especially in the beginning, really expensive. So when you think about it, everything from the manufacturing, the process to actually manufacture your products has to be so specific because there's time requirements, cooling requirements to make sure that you're within food safety standards. So making sure you're really dialed in on that piece of it. And then from there, you are typically shipping the products on a refrigerated truck, which is more expensive than a regular truck. And you're constantly battling the shelf life component, which is probably the trickiest part of it. It's that you have a much shorter shelf life typically with refrigerated products than you do with shelf stable products. And as a result, you are constantly kind of on a ticking timer from the moment you produce. And so when things go wrong, say, for example, a freight truck doesn't show up on the day it's supposed to, and it can't come again until a week later, you're losing a week of shelf life. And typically you have guaranteed days of shelf life to a distributor, for example. So I have to sell it to them within X amount of the shelf life. So you keep on kind of cutting it down from the moment you manufacture it, and you end up having to move product really quickly. And so I would say that's something that you end up having more spoilage as a result, or you might be out of stock as a result. There's a lot more quickly moving components and a lot less room for error. And so it's something that I think you learn very early on if you're working on a refrigerated product is that you have to be really, really precise in your planning. And of course, it's never going to be 100% perfect as things are rapidly evolving and businesses are growing. It's even harder to predict. But to some extent, you have to be as precise as possible, be really dialed on your inventory, demand planning. And not to say I've done it perfectly, but I've certainly learned my fair share of lessons along the way about how to properly plan for the coming months and accounting for growth when you think things are going to happen, but don't necessarily know the exact timing of them. The grocery business in general can move pretty slowly. And so I think that was one learning for me. It was like, even if a retailer says they want to carry your product, the time it takes to actually get it on their shelves is typically longer than you would like. And so accounting for those pieces of it too is really important, especially with a short shelf life product.
You know, if a founder is looking at the refrigerated space, what are a couple of skills that you think are like really, really important that they should have? They're non-negotiables as compared to, let's say, if they're selling a dry product.
Yeah, I would say being really detail oriented and analytical is very important. I will say for me personally, that's not my favorite part of the business is all the supply chain demand planning, but it is so important that you are being really accurate and diligent in tracking things because you have to know where all of your inventory is at all times so that you can properly account for it and also make sure that in the case something happens, for example, which is more likely with a refrigerated product that it could be left out somewhere, something spoils earlier than it's meant to, you can kind of trace that back to the lot code and when it was produced and every piece of the supply chain needs to be really diligently tracked. So I'd say someone who can be really in the weeds and analytical, definitely important. I think other pieces of it are the ability to build demand before you actually launch your product is really important just because once you make it, that timer starts on the shelf life. And so if you don't have plans of where it will be sold or who you're going to sell it to, it will go by really quickly and you'll probably end up with some spoiled product on your hand. And so making sure that you've validated that there is demand and also that there are people who are ready and willing to buy your product as soon as you make it is really important too.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have a misconception, even regarding the cold chain, where it's like, oh, I just manufacture it, I book a reefer truck, and it goes from there straight to the retailer. No, no, no. You got to maintain the cold chain, a certain, let's say, degree of Fahrenheit or Celsius percentage throughout that entire chain until it reaches the dock of the retailer. So, yeah, and there's multiple people involved, as you mentioned, a distributor in the middle and a retailer. So, yeah, maintaining that throughout is of course a challenge in itself.
Totally.
And another thing, Kendall, about your story that's really interesting is that like you've won multiple prizes, multiple pitch competitions as well. So I think Fairway and NIQ, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So what are you doing differently that other founders are not? They're not winning, basically. So we'd love to give any advice to us on that.
Yeah, I think a couple things I can point to. I think one, the actual product that we are making is truly innovative. There's nothing really like it on the shelf today. And so I think whether that is fully the case for your product or maybe it's a slight variation on something that exists today, getting really crisp in your storytelling of why your product is different and why people want it is super important. And so I think for a truly new product that there's nothing really like it on the shelf today, it's a little bit easier to articulate, hey, this is totally different. There's nothing like it out there and people want it. It makes a really compelling case. But even if it's something that maybe it's a different version of another product that exists, getting really crisp on what makes it different and why people would want it more than something else or why a different audience might want it is really important. And then I think the larger kind of piece of it is really telling your story effectively. And I point to social media, honestly, as something that's really helped me to hone in on this. It's continually telling your story and seeing what resonates versus not. I think a lot of founders can get into the trap of kind of you repeat your same pitch over and over and over, but you can do it so often they are not actually paying attention to what parts land with people versus maybe not. And I think I went through many, many iterations of how I communicated why I started this product, why it's different, and why someone should care. And I think when you can really get curious about what's landing with people and what's not, and how can I test out different ways of communicating this, social media is a great tool because it gives you your metrics, your engagement. You can see pretty easily what's actually landing with people. But even when you're talking to people live, I think just picking up on the cues of, okay, are they kind of eyes glazing over? This isn't really working. Or are they locked in? Are they asking follow-up questions? They want to know more. I think there's a couple things you can look out for that can help you understand how should I be telling my story. And I think I came from a consulting background too, which is also super helpful there because you're constantly in consulting, jumping around project to project, kind of piecing together information and making it into a really clear story for the client that you're serving of why they should do X, Y, or Z thing that you're recommending. And so really, really honing in on, okay, like, does every single detail of this story matter to the audience or am I going to lose them here or there? And being really critical with yourself. I think it's hard because it can be really personal for a lot of people. And so even just telling the story can feel a little bit daunting at first, but the more you can kind of treat it as an experiment, like I'm going to test telling it this way versus this way and see how people respond, it will lead you to the ultimate version that really lands with people.
That's a great point. It's a great point of that iterating the story constantly. Is there maybe an example of like, let's say you did this post on Instagram and this worked really well, or maybe you said something specific in a trade show and that just like was a light bulb moment. Any specific example there?
Yeah, I think something that comes to mind, and this is a little micro, but honestly interesting and I think valuable for other founders out there, is the way you even talk about your product. So in my case, when I initially was sharing on social media, I was referring to it as a cottage cheese based dip. And now on my packaging and in my storytelling, I refer to it as a whipped cottage cheese dip. And so I think a couple minor changes, and it's really like I swapped one word for another and changed where it fell in that description, but it makes a huge difference. It goes from the consumer can kind of assume that it's based with cottage cheese if you have the cottage cheese in there. So that's kind of an unnecessary word. And instead, putting in whipped as the first piece. So you have the textural cue as well. So someone who maybe wants to like cottage cheese but doesn't like it because of the texture, you can immediately signal to them that, hey, this is different. And you actually might like this because it's a whipped texture. It's not the same as that chunky cottage cheese you get on the shelf. And so that was something that I kind of through testing different messaging saw that was resonating a lot better with the consumer and was able to start articulating it that way, both in my pitch of the product, but also on our pack.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's a great example because even when I'm thinking about it, I'm like whipped cottage. Geez, that's already kind of making me excited to try the product, and I hope in the future I can try it in Canada.
Yes, I know.
But definitely, and then segueing from there, Kendall, into there's the consumer, there's the retailer, there's a distributor, there's yourself, there's a manufacturer, there's a warehouse, there's multiple partners throughout this entire supply chain that you're kind of working with. And of course, finding the right one can be make or break. So, what are things that you should look for when you're trying to, I guess, differentiate between a good partner from a bad one?
Yeah, I think a lot of things that I can go into there, but I would say number one is trust and really spending the time early on to get to know the partners that you're working with on a human level, even outside of a working level, just because, especially with a food product, you're placing so much trust in other people to execute their jobs the right way. And you have to let go of the control at some point. I couldn't be making the product in the commercial kitchen forever if I wanted to scale the business. And so handing that process off to a manufacturer, I'm putting all of my trust that I can be there some of the time to watch the production process, but I'm not going to be there all of the time. And I don't want to be there all of the time. I need to trust them that they can make the product the way they're supposed to. And so building that trust on a human level, I think really goes a long way so that when things do go wrong, because they inevitably will go wrong at some point, they are not hiding those things from you and instead are volunteering them and looking to problem solve with you and find a way around it. And I think you also, I mean, I've made mistakes at points too. And I'll give an example. My manufacturer, I had ordered packaging to my manufacturer that didn't arrive in time. And had I ordered it maybe a little bit earlier, we wouldn't have been as affected by the delay. And rather than at that point saying, hey, we have to cancel the production run, I went to my manufacturer and said, hey, here's the deal. The packaging is going to be in Denver tomorrow. It's not going to be where we need it to be, but it's going to be somewhat close. Any chance you could do me a huge favor and go pick it up in Denver and bring it to the manufacturing facility? And that's obviously a huge favor to ask of someone, but because we had built that trust and when they had made mistakes here or there, I was willing to work with them on it and be a partner. They were willing to return the favor when it came to something that I messed up. And so I think building that trust from the get-go is so, so important, especially with a food product where you might not know everything that's going on in the process. And ultimately, it's something people are consuming. It's food safety. There's real risk if things aren't done correctly all the way through the supply chain. So getting in person with those partners, meeting them, really building that relationship early on is so important.
I guess, are there any like signs that you should be looking at with the manufacturer that, yeah, this is kind of shady or this is a bit weird, like I should probably stay away, that are a bit more hidden? Of course, there are the main ones that everyone can look at, but stuff that maybe you've heard from peers or maybe you've seen yourself to look out for?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, number one is before you sign on with any manufacturer, ideally you can go out and be with them in their facility in person so you can see where your product will be made and how it's going to go down. I think a really important thing is to do a trial run ahead of actually doing a full production run and make sure that you have a contract around that trial run in addition to the production run. And so that will really make sure that you are aligned from the get-go of these are the key things we need to see for this to be a success and move on with the partnership. And if these things aren't true, then no harm, no foul, we can both walk away. And so I think that's something people are maybe too willing to jump into something right away because you're so excited you finally found a manufacturer that can make your product. But ultimately, if they're not going to make it the right way, it's not going to work for either side. So that's one thing I would say is like, as much as possible, get out there, do a trial, test everything before you commit to a long-term partnership. And then I think too, another thing, and I've heard this from other founders as well, as much as possible, if you can get references, other people they've worked with and can validate that they are a good partner, they do what they say they're going to do. There's a lot of sketchy things that can go on in manufacturing, especially around your IP. Like you're putting your product formula and the whole process in someone else's hands. And so making sure you have proper protections in place legally, but also making sure you feel really good about that person protecting your IP and not one day going off and making a similar product of their own and selling it or not sharing it with anyone that shouldn't have it. So you're putting a lot of faith in someone, making sure that you're both legally protected, but also just do your due diligence, get the references, go out there, meet them. I think a lot of times it's a gut feeling too. You know in your gut when something's not right. And I would say don't force it just because you want to meet your launch date or you want something to get out there quicker, which can be tempting. But taking the time to find the right partner is really crucial to the overall success of your business long term.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, and of course, a manufacturing partner in the end, it's a lot easier to switch the warehouse you're working with, or not as easy to switch a distributor, but still, your manufacturing partner switching there's a lot of work that has to be done. So
Yeah.
yeah, getting it right in the first time, of course, definitely helps a lot. Kendall, this was great. Thank you so much for all the incredible advice. At the end, one thing we always like to ask is, what do you wish that you had known on day one of starting Cotto when you were doing whipping up those first few batches at home?
Yeah, great question. I think one thing I wish I could, I guess, tell myself at that point is you're never going to have all of the answers. And at some point, you have to make decisions with the best information you have and go with your gut. And don't be afraid to do so because ultimately, you're never going to move forward if you are trying to get perfect information. Being a founder, operating a startup, you're going to be making quick decisions with imperfect information. And so trusting yourself to make the best decision you can, but also trusting yourself that if it's not the right decision, you can figure it out and problem solve around it. And not being afraid to kind of take the leap, make those decisions is so important to moving quickly and ultimately getting something off the ground. And I think too, not to be embarrassed of the stage that you're at. I think reminding yourself that everyone starts somewhere and even if you're in the kitchen making them yourself and selling it on the streets, like that is your story and it's ultimately going to be something you can leverage and story tell to get you to the next place. And so I think don't spend too much time in your own head kind of perfecting things, waiting for the right moment to share, but appreciate where you're at and think about one day when you're in the bigger stores, how you will be able to tell this story of how you got there. And you can't do one thing without the other. So I would say, like, just start, trust yourself, trust your gut, and also trust yourself to walk things back if you go the wrong route at some point.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, everyone loves a good story, and especially that founder story in CPG. And at the same time, it's like the whole thing of, build a plane. I think while you're going off the runway, there's some
Yeah.
saying like that. I think.
Yeah. Build the
But
plane as you're flying it.
exactly. Yeah, Kendall, this is great. Thank you so much for all the advice you imparted. Where can people find Cotto? Where can people try Cotto?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. If you are in the Northeast, you can try Cotto at lots of specialty stores on our website. We have a Find Us page where we have all of our stores on our store map. And then if you are not in the Northeast, we're expanding and growing quickly. So keep an eye on social media. We're at Get Cotto, Cotto, on both TikTok and Instagram and are always sharing updates and all the messy in between there as well. So would love if you follow along.
Amazing. And we'll link the store map in the description as well, in
Perfect.
the show notes. But yeah, Kendall, this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.